Hi, you are live with Lila and
Retired LAPD Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey.
hi, Sergeant Dorsey. Thank you so much for joining. I know how busy
Thank
you've been lately.
thank you for having me. Glad to be here.
This is a conversation that you and I had planned to have because unfortunately the need is ongoing. This is not a new thing. I think it's been sort of trending lately to talk about race relations and excessive force and communicating with law enforcement or as law enforcement. You hear terms like the blue wall of silence and all kinds of words and terms that are continuously thrown out there without a lot of context for many people. But for other people, the context is so deep and long and entrenched within a community that it's exhausting to have the conversation. And so for some people never having had the conversation and for some people being completely tired of having to have it over and over again, that's the spectrum. And so here we are to help all of those people who are exhausted by the conversation to still have it, and people who've never had the conversation to begin. So you have a unique perspective for those who are visually impaired. I'll let you know that Sergeant Dorsey is an African American woman, and she also spent 20 years, or a little bit more than 20 years, in your total career with the LAPD, working with 3 different police chiefs. You've seen all kinds of things happen, not just in your entire life growing up as a person of color in America, but on the force and as a member of law enforcement yourself. So you've book, you have all of this experience that kind of places you in a position to view things from angles than most of us do. So what I want to mostly do in this session is listen to what you feel is most important that we know, starting with communicating as law enforcement. So speaking on not on behalf of all law enforcement, but yourself as a law enforcement officer, retired, what do you feel the responsibility is or the ability at all for law enforcement in speaking out right now?
Well, I think the responsibility is to be honest and to acknowledge and admit the things that we're seeing, to affirm for those who are victims of it that we hear you and we're going to do something affirmative about it. For too long, Black and Brown communities have been complaining about aggressive, overzealous, drunk with power police officers to no avail. It wasn't until the advent of cell phones where we started seeing this on a regular basis. Certainly, we saw evidence of it in 1992 for the first time in a recording in the beating of Rodney King. Not much change. There was protest. There was, certainly damage and destruction, some of which communities have yet to recover from. And so I'm a little
Really?
curious as to what this current damage is all about. But nonetheless, fast forward to 2014, and then Ferguson, Missouri, with the fatal shooting of Mike Brown by a police officer, more protests, more talk of reform, justice, accountability, and none of it ever materialized. And that's why we're here today. I think it's very different this time in terms of we actually saw someone, many of us, for the first time, take their last breath. And so I think that's why there's so much outrage, because it's not often you get to see that, number one. And number two, we're seeing it after having complained and asked and begged and pleaded for some sort of reform and relief, and it just never came. And then to further exacerbate this particular situation, we know that this officer involved, Derek Chauvin, had 18 personnel complaints during his 19-year career. And so if
What
the
is a
police chief
personnel
over there,
complaint?
pardon me?
What is a personnel complaint? Just for people outside of law enforcement, what does that actually mean? Was something
It,
filed? Is that with a court? Is it official? Is it a slap
it's
on the
an
wrist?
it's an administrative complaint. In other words, on 18 different occasions, someone in the community notified that police department of wrongdoing, misconduct, and there was an investigation, allegedly, I'm assuming, I don't think they ignored the complaint. They would have had to at least investigate it. Now, how they decided to finally adjudicate it is a whole nother matter. Clearly, there was nothing done in terms of discipline that caused this officer to comport himself differently. And so,
Right.
with each complaint, it seemed to give him the nod that we're in agreement with your aggressive behavior, with your poor treatment of folks you promised to protect and serve. He learned nothing until the death of George Floyd.
Right. It's that what was communicated to him was through action, or in this case, inaction. Whether or not they investigated any of these claims, 18 times he was told, implicitly at least, we're with you, you're doing the right thing, your judgment is clear and sound, and you can continue doing your job. So the guilt for the knee on the neck belongs not only to the person whose knee it was, but to those who told him that judgment that led to that action was appropriate enough. And I want to pause because we're getting some comments, which I expected, and some questions. I have Russell Schultz putting out a suggestion that it's possible that the complaints were not valid. So let's look at this statistically. Just looking at the data, 18 complaints, is that a lot? Does that is that just typical? Is it that every officer at some point will have 18 complaints because people just make, or is that vastly imbalanced?
Well, let me say this. In comparison and contrast to my own personal career, I spent 20 years in uniform, in patrol, on the Los Angeles Police Department, a major metropolitan police department, who I would argue is probably far busier than whatever goes on over there in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Right.
Let's start with that. I spent my career working in South Central Los Angeles under the command staff of police chiefs Daryl Gates, Willie Williams, and Bernard Parks. So it's not like I didn't work in busy divisions. That's kind of code talk for where Black and brown folks live. That's where white officers typically want to go work because they can treat officers in busy divisions way different than they do over at Venice Beach or West LA division or any other affluent area. So I say that to say that in my 20-year career, having worked Operation South Bureau Crash, which is our gang unit, when gangs were prolific and drive-by shootings were occurring every day, having been involved in the Rodney King riots, I could probably count on one hand how many personnel complaints were made against me. And I can tell you, absolutely, I shot no one. So.
In 20 years, in circumstances like that, I think that the statistics, the data in this case, doesn't lie, and it does tell a story. So thank you for providing that context, because the contrast is important. And thank you, Russell, for the question. This is the kind of conversation, what if it's this, that is important to understanding the reality here, the gravity here. I want to say hi to our friend Dee Bowden and my friend Karen Cooper and my mother, Betty Rothbart. John Dougherty is just saying thank you, Sergeant Dorsey, and hello from Dubai. We have a comment from Deepak Bajpai. I'm not sure where he is, but he's asking why it's either why you so aggressive or why US so aggressive or why us. So Deepak, if you have a question or can clarify that, I'm not sure what you're saying. So it might just be like a language barrier, but I think, I'd like to just pull out the word aggressive, since you're talking about busy areas being code talk, and just calling out the word aggressive as code talk as well. When I speak about something, I'm an extremely aggressive person. I have always been this way. You can use that word to describe me, and it's pretty accurate. But when you speak to a person of color, especially a woman of color, and you use the term aggressive, it has a historical context. And using the term aggressive to describe people who, you couldn't see someone more calm than how Sergeant Dorsey is sitting here right now, giving us the data, generously providing her story, and calm as anything. And I just have this feeling that the word aggressive is not being used to describe me, which would be accurate. But if your perception is that Sergeant Dorsey is aggressive, I ask you to examine yourself and examine where that's coming from. Because if you really look at the data of what she looks like right now, there is nothing aggressive happening here. One of the things I wanted to talk about was bias. And so we'll get to that, but I'm calling out the word aggressive as we've been talking about code, things that people say that are maybe just things that, Russell's affirming that he thinks that he may mean USA. And I think that's true. Like, why is the US so aggressive? I mean, we have a lot of pain here, and we're also essentially teenagers as a country, but teenagers who have built our history on the enslavement of others and the continued enslavement in a non-traditional sense. So thank you for pausing and addressing that. I want to continue with our conversation and just listening.
Did you have a question or?
Oh, I'm looking at my mother's question right now.
Oh,
she said,
okay.
What could possibly be, and I think I can pin this here, what could possibly be the officer now for their actions with George Floyd? And we're talking, reminder to those who are new to this, that there are 4 officers we're talking about here, not just whose knee on the neck ended his life, but also the 3 who stood around and allowed it to happen without speaking up. So what could possibly, what's going to be the excuse, essentially? What are they going to say? Well, we were justified because.
We've kind of already got a glimpse of what the other 3 officers are going to say. Something like, I tried to get him to stop and he wouldn't, because understand, and I thought this to be the case in the beginning, that Derek Chauvin is the senior officer there on scene. He had 19 years on the job. The other 2 were very young. And I believe the Asian officer joined in 2008. So when you understand that, and listen, it's police culture, it's tradition, it's how things are done. And sometimes great deference is given to seniority. And so younger officers on the job will stand down, if you will, to a more senior officer. And I believe that this officer, Derek Chauvin, probably was the kind of officer who, I talked about this last night on my other social media platforms. We all know a guy like him. You don't want to work with him because he's a hothead. And because you know that he's probably going to do something stupid in the course of the shift that could get you and him in trouble, and you just would rather not. Right. And I think that he probably had a reputation around the station house as someone who most people really didn't want to work with. And so you know that he's going to do something inappropriate because that's who he is. And you know that he's not going to listen because that's who he is. And so you tend to just kind of say nothing and grit your teeth and hope you make it through the encounter unscathed. One of the officers said that he, in fact, said to Derek Chauvin, shouldn't we turn him over? I don't think he's breathing, to no avail. So I think their defense will be, you know, we did the best that we could, but understand this, while they're young on the job, they're adults.
Right.
They're all grown men. And no matter your rank, no matter your tenure, you have a responsibility. If you see misconduct occurring, you have to stop it, particularly if you're witnessing a murder. You should stop it. And so I don't know, and we probably will never hear from Derek Chauvin. I don't think he'll probably take the stand and testify in his own defense. I can't imagine what he could certainly say. Sitting on someone's neck in the manner that he did is contrary to our training. Sitting on that man's neck for almost 9 minutes as people were approaching and trying to intervene. Mr. Floyd was saying, you're hurting me, everything hurts, I can't breathe, I'm dying, and you sit and you watch and you do nothing. It's because it was more about punishing Mr. Floyd. It wasn't about gaining compliance. It wasn't about controlling him. It was punishment. Mr. Floyd was already in handcuffs. And we're trained, once a person is in handcuffs, you de-escalate the situation. That didn't happen.
I want to acknowledge that you're calling out what the training is, because so often training is blamed for what people choose to do with it. We have a question from Karen Cooper. Can change start with the way officers are trained? And I think you really addressed that you are trained to de-escalate. If we take out one element at a time, we're able to see the situation more objectively. If you take out that there was a person of color, and you can acknowledge your own bias this way, does your opinion of the situation change? And I'm asking the audience when I say your. Does your opinion of the situation change if you swap out a relatively healthy man of color for an older white woman? Does it change if you swap out the image of that person for a young child? Because ultimately, somebody in handcuffs on the ground is vulnerable. And so if you put an image of someone who's vulnerable in that place in your own mind, does your opinion of the treatment of that person change? Does your opinion of what would be required more outraged? And then I'll ask you to examine the levels of your own outrage when you swap out that person who was someone's son, somebody's community fellow, for someone in your own life. Does your level of outrage change? And we can begin to acknowledge our perception bias of what could have happened then. Because there really is no excuse. And it doesn't just come from training, because you're saying that training does include handcuffs and de-escalation. You also mentioned something before I want to go into a little bit more about this culture of these there's someone that we don't want to work with. That's just how he is. And we don't feel like getting into it. Everybody has responsibilities we don't want to take on, we don't want to step up to in our own lives. I mean, all of us. I often don't want to deal with difficult clients, and it's not the same thing at all, but if I want to get paid, I still have to. If I want to do my job, I still have to. So in the case of officers deciding that time and time, they just don't want to deal with him, at what point does it become the police chief's responsibility to look at, or any kind of internal affairs? There are 18 complaints. And it says that someone doesn't want to work with him. It says something. It definitely says something, and we've acknowledged that. So at what point should it be moved higher up to people? Like, whose responsibility must it be if it's not going to happen from underneath in the ranks?
I think that too is part of the culture. I think because, the way we're talked to, men and women on the police department, is if you have a beef with someone, back in the day when I came on, I came on right around the time where if you had a beef with another police officer, you took your Sam Brown off, your utility belt with your gun and handcuffs, right? You took it off, you went on the parking lot and you settled it.
Oh,
right.
At least you took the gun off, right?
Done. Yeah. You take everything off and you go in the parking lot and you settle it. And so by the time I came on, they weren't really fighting in the parking lot anymore. It was just a step above, but you were told, suck it up, get over it. Particularly as a woman, when I came on, there just weren't that many of us. It hadn't been long since LAPD had even certified women to be field patrol officers. Prior to that, the women were police women and they wore skirts. They were in the station. And so it had just only been a few years prior that females were able to, if they wanted to, go back through the police academy to be retrained and certified to work patrol, work the field. And so when I came on, if you had angst, it wasn't like people didn't know. The watch commander, who's a lieutenant or a sergeant or both, generally know who the knuckleheads are. And police officers are not shy about saying, there would be instances, and I've seen this happen in my own career, where some guys, especially if they had time on the job, would just come in and tell the lieutenant, I'm not working with him. Put me on the desk, or I'm going to go home sick, because they felt so strongly and principled about not wanting to be with this particular person. And so then it becomes, okay, so how do we manage this guy? Do we put him on the desk where he can't, wreak too much havoc? Do we put him in a patrol? We have one-man units that take reports. Back then it was called a U-boat. And you put them in the U-boat and they just drive around all day and they take reports from people who want to report something that doesn't really require a follow-up, or it's not a dangerous call. They just take simple reports. Someone came home and their home was broken into, and you have the U-boat go out and take a burglary report, or somebody woke up and their car window was smashed and items were taken out overnight. You have the U-boat go out and take a burglary from motor vehicle report. So officers who are not desirable partners wind up getting kind of the crappy details or the one-man unit details. Mm-hmm. So it's not like they don't know. And there was plenty of red flags. There are always red flags. When we see things that make national news, by the time an officer gets to killing someone, when we hear about their personnel history, we find out that there were examples. There were things that were known. The officer who shot Walter Scott in the back 8 times, that wasn't the first time Michael Schlager had said someone had tased someone inappropriately. That wasn't the first time, but it wasn't until it led to the death of Walter Scott that now he gets our attention. He's got the attention of the police department, and at this time they had to go ahead and do something, get him off the job.
Red flags are something we can all relate to. Everybody who's watching this, whether it's live or on the replay, and you and I, Sergeant Dorsey, we have had red flags in our own lives. When you see something with a person that tells you early on, what they're going to be like in a relationship, what they're going to be like as a friend, what they're going to be like to work with, usually in the first conversation with someone, we have in our subconscious stored memories of what facial expressions look like, what certain words mean in context. And we start to feel those things as instincts or intuition. And then the more time goes on and you actually see those things bigger, or you see them lived out or played out, you have the opportunity at that point to say, you know what, my intuition was right, my instincts were right. Those red flags are not just red flags, but they're flare guns. And so by the time you get to somebody's wrongful death, you have seen the flares go up. It's like beyond red flags at that point. So where between like red flags and flare guns, is it the responsibility of the department, the police department, or is it someone else? Is it the district attorney? Is it somebody else in government or public opinion, or anywhere that can be calling things out in a bigger way earlier, so that it doesn't take the death of someone for us to pay attention to what we should have seen the whole time?
I believe the onus is on the police department. I mean, who knows better what's going on than immediate supervisors, the sergeants that are out in the field with this guy, who have to respond to a citizen complaint in the field when they say get a sergeant, and you got to go out 2 or 3 times a month or a week because somebody is complaining about this guy. And as a supervisor, it's my responsibility to then report it to my lieutenant in my paperwork at the end of the day, so my lieutenant knows what's going on out in the field. And then the lieutenant up and down up the chain, is going to write a report about his time on the watch to his captain, who will know what's going on with his officers. And so, again, it's not like they don't know. I think part of it is because, there's for so long been men in these positions. There's starting to be women who are police chiefs and watch commanders and higher ups on departments. I think we do a better job. I just think we do.
Women
acknowledging, that there's a problem, men. And that's why for so often, being in a male dominated occupation like I was, when I did come forward with a problem, it was always get over it. I had a partner when I was on probation, my training officer. He put me in a pain compliance hole, a twist lock is what he put me in, because I wanted to eat. I was hungry. And my training officer said to me, as far as he was concerned, probationers could eat out of the vending machine. He was driving that day because as a rookie, you don't get to drive. You're like a child. And so you're just the passenger. And he refused to stop on the way to the station. And so it wasn't until we got back to the station, I walked across the street to a fast food restaurant to get something to eat. He saw me eating and he came to me like I was a child and demanded to know, why did I go get something to eat when he told me I could eat out of the vending machine? And so he put me in this pain compliance hole. He grabbed me in the police station, twisted my arm behind my back. I don't know what he was going to do. Another officer finally intervened and made him let me go. The point being, when my lieutenant found out, my lieutenant, the watch commander, when he found out what happened, he called me into his office and he said, I don't know what's going on with you two. I want you to knock it off. And I want you two to go back out in the field and get along. And I said, Lieutenant, my training officer just put me in a pain compliance hole in the police station. I'm not going back out in the field with him because I don't know what he might do to me when we get out in the field.
Right. You need to be able to trust someone that you're partnered with of any rank to treat you with respect. You have to be able to trust each other to make those calls about how to treat other people. And if they're not even treating you with respect, and you're a police officer, to be fair, like, not only are you another human being, but you have come through the same steps that they had to in order to become a police officer. You've earned the respect of that person.
And so when I say it's the culture, you understand it's so entrenched, it's so systemic. It's just the way it is. And if you understand that those kinds of things occur in the station between officers, then it's very easy to understand how it extends out to the community. And for the life of me, what I don't get, and again, maybe it's because they're men at the top, I don't understand why in any other corporation, if you have employees who have anger management issues or alcohol problems or whatever it is, there are employee assistance programs to help them. Right? But when you're a police officer, it's not sexy to tell. So officers don't self-report. That's why you have so many instances of divorce, alcoholism, suicide amongst police officers, because I don't think that we are getting the kind of attention that we need. And since we're not going to self-report, I think police chiefs should compel us to be psychologically reevaluated every 2 years and just make sure we're in a good headspace. The only time that happens is when an officer is involved in a deadly shooting. That's the only time they make you go talk to a psychologist.
It seems like something that would be useful to know that people who are armed and out there to uphold laws and who are constantly under the stress, like, let's be honest, that it is not an easy job to be a police officer, no matter what. But if you're out there in the field and you're putting your life at risk every day just by showing up in areas where police are distrusted, wearing your uniform, just by walking out of the door, you're in a stressful position. Even if it wasn't for the sake of making sure that those people make safe decisions, to just check in on people who put their lives on the line. I feel the same about our veterans and people in the armed forces, that we should be doing so much of a better job protecting the mental health and creating open conversations where people very often feel silenced by culture. If you want the culture to change, you have to have some kind of a change. And I think that's a really good suggestion. Do you think that there's a reason why? Is it shame? Is it cultural? What is the reason why that hasn't been done already?
It's a little bit of all of that. Like I said, it's not sexy to, report. There's ribbing that goes on, right? You don't want to be teased by your peers. You don't want to be thought less than, right? So you don't acknowledge and admit that you have a situation. When I was a supervisor, we had a jumper, a young man who was up on a building for about 30 minutes, and we were speaking to him, and eventually he jumped. And when he jumped, he didn't die. And as he jumped, you could hear the collective, oh, as we watched him go from the top of the building down to the pavement. And I can remember right now what it sounded like when he hit. And watch him not die immediately. watch his body convulse and shake. And it bothered me. And when I cleared the scene, I went right back to the station and told my lieutenant, this was gnarly. And can you get somebody from BSS down here? Because I know I'm bothered. And I think maybe some of my officers might be as well. And my lieutenant thought it was a good idea. And we had BSS come and wait for the officers as they returned to the station. And by the time the officers got in, I notified those that were on the scene and said, hey, BSS is here if anybody wants to talk. And everybody said, no, Sarge, I'm good. I'm fine. And I said, well, I'm not. I'll talk to him. And I was the only one that wanted to sit down and would admit that that bothered me. And that's just one of many things that I've seen over my 20 years that stick with me to this day. And so since every police chief, every captain was at some point a patrol officer, they know what we see day in and day out. On the LAPD, when you work vice unit, and I worked vice as a supervisor, you can only do it for 18 months. It's a limited tour. That's it. After 18 months, you got to go. And the belief and understanding is because you get exposed to some gnarly stuff working vice, and they don't want you to get too twisted.
Too twisted.
If the department too twisted. And so if the department understands that about vice, why wouldn't they have that same kind of compassion for their officers who see things every day that can really get in your head in a way that could be problematic, or that you work with a partner who they know is uber aggressive and is insisting that you be that too. And because it's so important for officers to know that my partner's got my back. In other words, that you're going to be there, you're going to acquiesce, you're going to condone, you're not going to say anything. If you see me do something wrong, I got your back. It's a big deal. And so when you are not strong and not principled, like these three officers who stood by and watched a man be murdered, it's very easy to understand how that can happen. Maybe those officers would have liked to have said to the watch commander, please, I don't want to be with this guy. I don't want to be around him. And here's why. Don't talk to me. Go talk to him.
Right. There are so many opportunities that, in retrospect, it's not just those three officers, but so many officers have had. And there are some watching this right now, and some silently. And I thank you for being here to remember all those times you could have said something. And I want to acknowledge that, Sergeant Dorsey, when you were the one to speak up and say, I'm bothered, it might be, and you've brought up the gender conversation too, which I think is interesting, that women are not socially expected to bottle up our feelings as much. So it's almost like there's a permission for us to feel that male officers might not feel they have in the same way. So that was a position of privilege in a way, that you as a female officer felt it was your right to express a feeling. Is there a perceived danger to allowing things to get to you as pertains to your ability to do a job?
No, there's not a perceived danger, I don't believe. I think there's certainly, like I said, you don't want to be ribbed. Police officers are like 12-year-olds, and they'll tease you and they'll tell everybody in the station, and then you kind of become the air quote laughing stock. You're called names, that start with the letter P and end with a Y. And so, you don't want that. So you just pretend like everything is good and I'm okay and I'm not bothered, or, I really don't want to hit this guy, but my partner did. And then he looked to me to see if I was going to hit too. So I had to. So that kind of stuff goes on. Like I said, it's the culture. It's absolutely, what's expected.
We have programs in elementary to deal with bullying, and what we enfranchise children with, the tools that we give children to stand up to bullies who make fun of them, or how to handle it, to be stronger within themselves. There are really excellent programs that are out there, and I wonder if they would do well to do those same kind of programs, in a different version, but within these kinds of environments, a police force or in the military, where there's that stronger than that, tougher than that, we can handle it mentality. because essentially what you're asking people to do is play into a culture that silences people and makes them feel smaller and less powerful. And we can't feel less powerful, especially if you're on a police force. You must feel powerful. In order to go out there and confidently do your job, you must feel power. So can you recommend something for officers who are in an environment where they dread being the one to bring something up that might bring about change? Is there something that they can say? Like for example, how you stood up and you said, well, I'm bothered. Even maybe, and this is one idea and I'd love to hear from you, maybe somebody saying, all right, we know that was messed up. I'm here to listen if anybody's bothered. Even not admitting your own, like that you're bothered, saying, I'm here to listen if anybody's bothered.
Well, I don't think that environment is conducive to that. I mean, police officers are typically, alphas, whether they're guys or girls. And so unless and until a police chief or sheriff or commissioner creates those safe zones, those safe places where you can have those honest discussions or where you can report. I mean, listen, there's whistleblower protection, but there's no such thing, because the other thing that, which we see happening in the street, retaliation, people being punished, retaliation happens internally. My issues on the police department in my 20 years were never with the community. It was always what was going on internally, what was going on in the station, what my partners were doing that was bothersome. And that's not to say all of my partners, because I had, for the most part, amazing, amazing partners of all ethnicities. But I also worked with some knuckleheads, and they were known knuckleheads, and they were knuckleheads from start to finish. That's who they were. And so that's why I think it would be helpful if police chiefs would just compel the officers. There's an issue, the culture, you grew up in it. So make them sit down. You can't make them talk. You can't make them be honest, but you may have an officer who might hear something that resonates with them that would get them to break that yoke, if you will, and be honest about what it is that they need. Because at the end of the day, the goal would be to have that officer be the best employee they can be.
Right.
And if they're a good employee in-house, they're going to be a good employee in the field.
That's great. I love that you're encouraging an atmosphere of mentorship from leadership. I think that's so important. I love that idea, that maybe it's in leadership training and how those conversations happen. Saying, look, if there are 18 complaints about you, obviously we've got your back, right? But within that, let's talk about how you're approaching things, because we want you to be the best that you can be. And I think that approach is a really great idea. You said a few knuckleheads, and it's reminiscent to me of what people are saying, including in the comments, a few bad apples, right? People saying, and often excusing the behavior that happens by saying, but most police officers are really good people. Yes, that's true. That's totally true. Bad apples, a few knuckleheads. But if the system is designed to protect them, then it's a knucklehead system. And it's going to take change that's systemic, including taking actions at a leadership level to change that. We have go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, no, I agree. And, I certainly am of the opinion that by and large, most officers are there for the right reason. They come to work every day with their head on straight, and they're there doing amazing things. And just like in the news, if it bleeds, it leads, and so we see those few. We see them over and over and over again. And it's so interesting, because I did a radio interview this morning, and it was kind of interesting to me that at the end, I was talking much like I am now. And at the end, the anchor said, well, I want to make sure that everybody understands that, we support police officers and that police officers are doing the right thing. And I thought, isn't that funny that she wants to assure everybody that? Because that's not what the media shows. The media doesn't show the police officers who go to a radio call of a theft, and it's some elderly woman who's stealing a dozen eggs because she's hungry. And the officer who responds to the call, rather than arrest her, buys groceries for her and then takes her home and helps her get them in the house. Those kinds of things happen. And they happen on all 18,000 police departments, just like we see the knuckleheads on all 18,000 police departments. But it's not sexy to report that either. Who wants to sit up and see a police officer doing a good deed? They want to see the salacious stuff. They want to see officers beating folks like we're seeing for 24/7 right now with this protest. I mean, 6 officers were arrested and charged in Atlanta. Overnight, you saw officers in Buffalo, New York, shove a 76-year-old man down. He hit his head on the pavement and is in serious condition, could conceivably die. We've seen instance after instance during this protest of officers being extra aggressive, unnecessarily aggressive, but they want you to know that there's a lot of good police officers out there.
Well, if we really want to protect police officers, then protecting the reputation by telling the good stories is part of that. Because there is a bias, because the media is only showing these negative stories. There's a danger in the bias that when you see, when let's say there's a person of color who encounters a police officer in the street, they might feel scared as a result of that uniform representing the system that allowed these things to happen. And not knowing, is that going to be the person who's going to take my life? Is that going to be the person who the system protects? The uniform represents not just the positive, but represents the system that protects the negative as well. Protecting police officers can include sharing those positive stories. Protecting people of color should include that as well. You look at the narrative in our country of when you hear, immediately, if you hear police officer and Black man, there is a perception of what you think the story is going to be. Russell and Karen are both calling out in the comments here that the media needs a culture change too. If we really care about protecting our police officers, then telling all the stories can be part of that, but also protecting the mental health, protecting an environment in which they can work and feel free to speak up about injustice is also protecting police officers. Creating systems where if they need to speak up because they're seeing somebody's life at risk, protecting those police officers in their right to do that is important too. Just protecting each other can mean a lot of different things. And it sounds like the culture has only protected bad behavior more than it's protected protective behavior. Is that true?
I think what the culture, what police departments do is they protect the entity, the organization. I feel like police chiefs have an obligation, it seems, to protect that organism. And so you never hear a police chief say, in front of a bank of cameras that there was a shooting that was inappropriate. Very rarely, I won't say never, but very rarely, something should not have happened, because most police chiefs understand that civil liability is coming, and so they're not going to give a soundbite that's going to be to the support for an officer who took the life of someone. So they always say it's under investigation, we're still looking at it, there's stuff we don't know. So they will never admit it. But I think if police chiefs really wanted to change this, and they have great, tremendous autonomy, police chiefs run their fiefdoms. We have independent civilian review boards on some departments. We have one here in Los Angeles, the LA Police Commission. They make recommendations. New York has a civilian review board. They make recommendations. And when you make a recommendation to the police chief, they say, okay, thank you. And then they do what they want. So they really do answer to no one. And it would be helpful if rather than protect that entity and that organism, and thereby on few occasions protect the officer, if they would just really protect the community. Because listen, monies are going to be paid, and it's not police department money, it's not money from the officer, it's taxpayer money. And they understand that. And it seems like they're more willing to just not acknowledge anything. And when all of these big $1 million payouts happen, there's always a stipulation that we're not admitting guilt. We're not going to discuss it, and neither will you. but we're going to give you massive amounts of money. We won't change policy or procedure. And then we'll wash, rinse, repeat the next time an officer takes the life of someone contradictory to their training and maybe law.
I think a system of checks and balances is a great idea. You know, just like what we have in the rest of government, right? We have in our Constitution, which, you know, I have a copy of my Constitution like within arm's reach, and I am all for protecting it. Within that Constitution are some really good ideas, including checks and balances within the three branches of our government: legislative, executive, and judicial, where there is power, there is responsibility, and yet there's still someone for them to answer to. So maybe something beyond a recommendation is a good idea. That would take a lot, but I think that if you, as a police department, it would be hard to hear that there are going to be civilians who don't get it making decisions about their decisions, because it is so extreme of a life to live, of a career to have to uphold, to execute these values and to uphold them in the community where you're literally under fire. And I think that there are ways of responding to that. You know, there are ways of responding to they don't get it, right? So having to take a test or something before you code that you can like before you're able to put you through. There are always things that we can do. So there, I think if we want to take away from this conversation a few actionable items, we have some really great ones. For example, being a mentor as a leader within the organization, being responsible as an adult, even if you are below someone in a hierarchy within the organization, and perhaps outside of the organization, if you're in legislation, suggesting some kind of bill for checks and balances that do hold departments, systems accountable for the way that we respond to red flags, shots fired, you know, as a big flare gun, and of course, ultimately to the ultimate transgressions when somebody ends up losing their life because of excessive force. So those are some things that we can do to acknowledge the system. And with the last 10 minutes, we'll take some questions here. If you want to put some into the chat, I see a question. How can we help get more of the good stories out there? Ask for them. You know, I have Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey here. I can ask her, you know, and she already has volunteered positive stories. You want to go and hear positive stories of people of color? Go ask for them. You want to hear positive stories from law enforcement? Go ask for them. Ask for the stories that you want to hear. Ask for the stories that you feel are missing. Ask for the details. I think that if you scroll through the comments here, Russell Schultz has done a really good job of modeling, asking for the details, trying to understand one situation at a time. You know, he wanted to know, you know, the length of time that the knee was. I'm trying to find that question. I think it was this. Why did he maintain that position with the knee on the neck for 8 minutes? Was he waiting for a transport or EMS? He's not asking for the question, but for the answer, but he has some questions. I think regardless of what the answers are to those questions right now, having those kinds of questions and being willing to ask them, seeking to understand rather than seeking to judge, is a really good step in the right direction. So I want to thank Russell for modeling detailed question asking without resorting to the next thing I want to talk about, which are negative terms, bias reinforcing, divisive language. You are in a position, Sergeant Dorsey, that you must be hearing hate speech all the time, whether it's on the media or people commenting on things. As an African-American woman, you know, growing up and then in the force, you must be hearing this. What's been your response to the kinds of conversations that have happened and the language people use?
Well, thankfully, LAPD trained me well, so I'm not thin-skinned. You can't do what I do and be bothered by what people say. And I have since I started speaking like this in 2014. People come for me on social media. They don't like what I say, and they're mean, caustic, threatening. And so I don't really take it personal, much like when I was in uniform and someone um, resented me, maybe someone who looked like me because I'm in that uniform. Because at the end of the day, I know they don't know Cheryl Dorsey, they know the uniform.
Sergeant
And
Dorsey.
so, Sergeant Dorsey. But what I do is just tell you what I know, tell you what I've lived. I hope I say something that will resonate and provide clarity. And I always say, your agreement is not required. I'm going to tell you the truth. You do with it what you want. You decide how important it is for you. And if it's not useful, then keep it moving.
Right. I like that a lot. That attitude of if it don't apply, let it fly, which is my friend Leshian Williams. It's his quote that he says a lot. If it don't apply, let it fly, which I love. But I think that most people don't have that attitude. Most people see hurtful words and allow it to silence them. They stop speaking. They stop sharing their stories, good or bad. And I think that there are two sides to that in terms of our responsibilities. There's the responsibility to speak up anyway. And Karen's asking, how do we educate youth better? Talking about it on purpose, even when it's hard, and encouraging that in others is one part of that. The other part is educating people on how to have these conversations, asking for facts, asking for information without using divisive terms. So I saw somebody post something on LinkedIn, a professional platform. I think it was a list of celebrities who are donating money or covering the bail for people who are arrested in riots. And I don't remember the name of that organization, but I think it was Colin Kaepernick who they were calling out, or was like, he already is a polarizing political figure for having taken a knee during the national anthem at football games. But so somebody shared this on LinkedIn and said, FYI, here are the celebrities and businesses who are funding the bail of, and then they use some term like these animals, those people, criminals, and using terms like that. Even saying they makes it feel like we're not all humans, like we don't all have the same group. So using words like they, I would encourage people to be more specific. Say rioters, say protesters, say looters, which by the way are three different groups of people. That they're not all, within the same. If you do a Venn diagram, there's some overlap, but not a lot. But using generalized terms is not helpful. What other advice would you give to people who need to become more aware of their own language, their own purpose in speaking?
Well, I think, everybody has to do what makes sense to them. And so I'm not one to lecture anybody on how to
Oh, I am.
how to present yourself or what to say or what to do. I say just speak your truth. And I always encourage people to be respectful and listen. And what I've said today, I'm sure there's some people who may be here who don't find it helpful. And so that's okay too. We can agree to disagree. But I hope that I might say something that would resonate with someone. Listen, I have 4 sons, and I'm constantly talking to my children, and sometimes my delivery is not always the best, but I say it anyway. And I hope that something will stick with them, and when they find themselves in a situation they'll recall those conversations that we had, and I have them over and over. My kids are constantly telling me I watch too much news, I do too much, I'm way over the top all the time, but I'm over the top all the time. And so, I encourage people to just have those conversations, be honest, be frank, and you know, again, your agreement is not required.
Yeah, I'm seeing some questions here about that, how to have these conversations and start these conversations. Can you open with, listen, I want to talk about this. Your agreement is not required, but I do request participation. Might be a good way to start those conversations. Any other good conversation starters or opening questions for parents with their children, for children with their parents, for people in communities? What are some of the things that we should be asking ourselves, wherever we fall, whatever our role is?
I think what rather than say what someone should ask, I just say create a space where it's safe to ask, right? Create a space where it's safe to have the conversation, and then just let it flow, because you have to meet people where they are, and everybody may not be in that place where they use the right words or the right term, or they may be easily excited about a thing. And
Right.
and sometimes, even in texting or emails or on Facebook, these social media platforms, there's no tone in text as we started here, and it's very easy to see something and view it in a way that wasn't intended. But I
Right.
think it's more important to just create those safe spaces where it can occur.
I think that's great. Safe spaces, create them yourself. Karen has a suggestion of something you can say about what's going on. I think that's great. It's a neutral question. And other things that we can do to create those safe spaces, I'll be speaking to in the coming days. But setting your intention to protect the people in your environment, to include, to be welcoming of different ideas, to even saying your agreement is not required, but welcoming them still into the conversation. I think that does create a safe space. I think that that having that attitude creates a safe space, even for disagreement, which is something that I think is important, because through disagreement, we see what the objections are, and we can at least then address them. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that the people watching this take away from this episode, or something that they do differently today?
I guess maybe just the last thing that I would like to say is that I think, everybody has a part to play in this discourse. And I think that, none of us get it right all the time. For folks who have angst with the police, I say comply and complain. Many times officers may respond to a situation, and we maybe have given information that may or may not be accurate, but we're acting on that in good faith, and it can be off-putting. Comply. If you're not happy with the kind of service that you're receiving, then you complain. There's policies and procedures in place for that to happen. I think sometimes, especially these young people, think that, they know their rights and they don't have to do a thing. And then it becomes a test of wills, because once a police officer decides that you're going to go to jail, or you're going to get out the car, or you're going to come here, you will. They'll make you. And so I think there needs to be a little better way to communicate and understand. And even though it's not community's responsibility to de-escalate a situation, I don't think there's any harm or shame in doing that. I see nothing wrong with wanting to live and survive a police encounter. And so if that means being quiet, if that means letting the officer talk to you in a way that would otherwise be offensive and unacceptable, the goal is to go home safely. Both sides want to go home safely. Community wants to go home safely, and certainly police officers want to go home safely.
100%. Thank you for that. There are people who speak down to us no matter what. There are bosses who are, nasty to their employees. I've had one before. There are people in your life who will curse at you or swear at you and minimize your existence. And it's up to you to decide how to handle your interaction with that one person, rather than allowing it to color your experience with an entire group that you feel they represent. But it is on the individual as well to stay safe first, and then to exercise your voice later. I think comply and then complain is really helpful. And I think comply, complain, or comply and share. If you had a safe experience, if you feel you treated unfairly, share that story as well. Telling all of the stories and using our voices to call out when there is injustice. I think that there is just one last thing I want to bring up, which is the imbalance of, look, on Yelp, people just go there to complain about stuff. That restaurant is probably awesome, right? And it's just that people always go there to complain, but there are restaurants with 5-star reviews. And there are people who will have like one complaint on there, but when it's that unbalanced and all of the reviews call the restrooms dirty, you better believe that the health department is going to be in there looking at it. And hopefully they'll address it. And you don't have to go to a dirty restroom in a restaurant again. If there is dirty behavior, don't let it stop you from giving 5-star reviews of the food or the service. Just complain about what it is that you have to complain about, and let those facts be out there. Let them be documented. Documentation of abuse, no matter what it is whether that's from the police or within your community, within your own relationships. Filing reports and getting documented instances of bad behavior is your responsibility when communicating on your and on behalf of that you are a part of. So I hope that people will go back and listen to this conversation again, comment with what you feel your takeaways were. And if you want to find Sergeant Dorsey, I definitely recommend ordering her book, Black and Blue. I'll edit this post with a link to it, and I'll also put it in my LinkedIn profile. You can also find Sergeant Dorsey's profile and a link to buy her book there. Hear her stories being Black and Blue. And go back through here. On the ticker below, you'll see Sergeant Cheryl Dorsey on Instagram and Twitter, on YouTube, and her podcast. Look up Sergeant Dorsey Speaks, SGT Dorsey Speaks, and her website, sergeantcheryldorsey.com. Sergeant Dorsey, thank you so much for bringing all of your experience, your openness, your calmness, how productive you've allowed this conversation to be. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate you as well.
And thanks to all of you who have joined us.